When waitress Ellie Rivera helps a disabled young man at her diner, she catches the eye of his billionaire father. What began as a simple act of kindness will force her to choose between her own dreams and healing a broken family before it's too late. Before we continue, consider my humble request to like and subscribe. It's completely free. Ellie Rivera stared at the eviction notice taped to her apartment door. Final warning glared at her in bold red letters, 3 months behind on rent while her mother's medical bills piled up on the kitchen counter. Something had to give. Not today, she whispered, tucking the notice into her bag. Her waitress uniform hung on the bathroom door, freshly washed but fraying at the collar. The small silver sparrow pendant her grandmother had given her caught the morning light as she fastened it around her neck. Resilient, she reminded herself, like sparrows. When she arrived at Rosie's diner for her shift, Marcy, the hostess, gave her a sympathetic look. "Manager's looking for you." Something about cutting hours. Ellie's stomach dropped. Fewer hours meant less money for her mother's Alzheimer's care facility. She was already working double shifts whenever possible. "I'll talk to him after lunch rush," Ellie said, tying her apron with trembling fingers. The bell above the door chimed just as she finished setting up her section. A man in an impeccably tailored suit entered, followed by a young man in a motorized wheelchair and a woman in scrubs. The young man's movements were jerky, his head tilted at an angle that suggested cerebral palsy. The trio made their way to a corner table, the father walking ahead while the nurse guided the wheelchair. "I'll take this one," Ellie told Marcy, grabbing 3 menus. As Ellie approached, she overheard the father speaking tersely into his phone. "I don't care what the board thinks. The acquisition goes through with or without their blessing. I'll be back in the office in an hour." "3 for lunch?" Ellie asked, forcing brightness into her voice. "Yes," the man said distractedly, not bothering to look up. Ellie noticed the son's eyes following her movements, a spark of awareness that contradicted his physical limitations. She addressed him directly. "Is this spot okay for your chair?" The young man made an affirmative sound. His father looked surprised at Ellie's direct engagement. "Jason will have the chicken soup and a chocolate shake," the father said, still not looking up from his phone. "I'll take a club sandwich, no mayo." "And what would you like?" Ellie asked the nurse. "Caesar salad, dressing on the side," she replied quietly. As Ellie turned to leave, Jason made another sound, more insistent this time. She turned back. "I think he wants to order for himself," Ellie suggested gently. The father finally looked up, irritation flashing across his face. "Jason can't—" "He communicates fine," Ellie interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "Just differently." The nurse looked alarmed, but Jason's face lit up. Ellie noticed a communication board attached to his wheelchair. "May I?" she asked, pointing to it. Jason nodded enthusiastically. With the nurse's help, Jason pointed to several pictures on his board. "Cheeseburger and chocolate shake," Ellie translated, smiling. "Good choice. Our burgers are the best in town." When she returned to the kitchen, her hands were shaking. She'd just contradicted a customer who was clearly wealthy and powerful, but the look on Jason's face had been worth it. "Order for table 7, she told Frank, the cook, "and make that burger special." When she delivered their food, the father, who had introduced himself as Robert Caldwell during one of her check-ins, watched with undisguised curiosity as Jason struggled to grasp his burger. "Would you like some help cutting that up?" Ellie asked Jason, who nodded. "Caroline can assist him," Robert said quickly. "I don't mind," Ellie replied, already pulling up a chair. With practiced movements, she cut the burger into manageable pieces, all while chatting with Jason about whether the Bulldogs would win their game this weekend. "You seem experienced with this," Robert observed. "My cousin has Down syndrome," Ellie explained, adjusting Jason's straw so he could reach his milkshake more easily. "And before I had to drop out of nursing school, I worked with several patients with mobility challenges. You were in nursing school. Robert's full attention was on her now. Was being the operative word. Turns out you can't pay tuition with good intentions. The words came out more bitter than she had intended. Before Robert could respond, Jason made an excited sound. He was pointing at Ellie's pendant. It's a sparrow, she explained, leaning closer so he could see it. My grandmother gave it to me. She said sparrows might be common birds, but they're incredibly resilient. They find ways to thrive anywhere. Like waitresses who should be nurses? Robert asked, something shifting in his expression. Ellie met his gaze steadily. Something like that. She was saved from further conversation by her manager, who appeared suddenly at her elbow. Ellie, a word. His tone made it clear it wasn't a request. In the back hallway, he didn't mince words. We're cutting everyone's hours, economy's tight and the owner's breathing down my neck. I can only give you 3 shifts next week. The room seemed to tilt. Mark, I can't. My mother's care facility. I'm sorry, Ellie. It's 3 shifts or none. When she returned to the dining room, her smile was fixed in place, but her mind was racing with calculations. 3 shifts wouldn't even cover her mother's medication, let alone the facility fees. At table 7, Robert was signing the check. Caroline had taken Jason to the restroom. Everything all right? Robert asked, noting her expression. Fine, Ellie said automatically. Robert studied her for a moment. No, it's not, but thank you for what you did for my son today. It's been a long time since I've seen him so engaged. Ellie nodded, not trusting herself to speak without her voice breaking. As they left, Robert handed her a business card with a number scrawled on the back. Caldwell Technologies. I have a proposition for you, Ms. Rivera. Call this number tomorrow. She stared at the card, then at the tip he'd left, a $100 bill. Her first thought was for her mother's medication. Her second was suspicion about what kind of proposition a billionaire might have for a waitress. As she cleared their table, she noticed Jason had arranged his leftover fries into the rough shape of a bird. A sparrow, perhaps. She carefully preserved it until the very last moment before wiping the table clean. That night, she stared at the business card on her kitchen table, positioned precisely between the eviction notice and her mother's latest medical bill. The sparrow pendant rested beside them, catching the dim light of her single lamp. Resilient, she thought, but even sparrows needed somewhere to land. Morning sunlight spilled across Ellie's kitchen table, where Robert Caldwell's business card lay between her bills. She'd been awake most of the night, weighing her options. Pride told her to rip up the card. Practicality reminded her of the eviction notice and her mother's care facility payments. Her phone felt heavy in her hand as she dialed the number. Caldwell speaking. His voice was crisp, businesslike. This is Ellie Rivera, from the diner yesterday. Her throat felt tight. Ms. Rivera, I'm glad you called. There was a pause. I'd like to offer you a position as my son's personal care assistant. Ellie blinked. I'm not a certified nurse. You dropped out of nursing school, correct? And you clearly have experience with people with disabilities. His tone softened slightly. More importantly, Jason responded to you. Caroline is qualified, but she's leaving for another position next week. The agency keeps sending replacements who treat my son like he's invisible. Like you did? The words slipped out before she could stop them. Ellie pressed her hand to her mouth, certain she'd just ruined whatever opportunity he was offering. The silence stretched for several seconds. Yes, Robert finally said, his voice quieter. Like I did. That's exactly why I need someone who will see him as a person, not a condition. He named a salary that made Ellie's breath catch. Plus benefits, of course, including health insurance that would cover dependents. Her mother's face flashed in her mind. Can I think about it? Of course, but I need someone by Monday. His tone became more formal again. If you're interested, come to this address tomorrow at 10 a.m. See the position for yourself before deciding. After they hung up, Ellie sat motionless at her table, the sparrow pendant clutched in her palm. The salary would cover her mother's care, with enough left to pay off her debts. But working for a man who barely acknowledged his own son? Yet she'd seen something shift in Robert's eyes when she'd helped Jason. A crack in whatever wall he'd built between himself and his son's condition. The next morning, Ellie stood before the Caldwell mansion's ornate gates, feeling as out of place as a food stain on fine china. The security guard checked her ID, then directed her up the curved driveway. The house was exactly what she'd expected. Sprawling, immaculate, cold. Robert met her at the door, dressed in casual clothes that probably cost more than her monthly rent. "Thank you for coming." He led her through a marbled entryway into a sunlit room where Jason sat in his wheelchair near floor-to-ceiling windows. He brightened visibly when he saw Ellie. "Hey, Jason," she said warmly, crouching to his eye level. "Good to see you again." Jason made excited sounds, pointing to her neck where the sparrow pendant rested. "You remembered?" She smiled, touching it. "Smart guy." "He has a gift for you," Robert said, handing her a clumsily wrapped package. He insisted on wrapping it himself. Took over an hour. Ellie carefully unwrapped it to find a book about birds. Inside, a page was marked with a sticky note. Sparrows. "Thank you, Jason." Her voice wavered slightly. "This is perfect." For the next hour, Robert showed her around the house, explaining Jason's daily routine, medical needs, and therapy schedule. Caroline demonstrated the equipment Jason used and the techniques that worked best for helping him eat, dress, and communicate. "He has a speech therapist on Tuesdays and physical therapy 3 times a week," Robert explained. "He's more capable than many doctors initially thought. His mind is sharp, but his body doesn't always cooperate." "And where are you during all this?" Ellie asked, watching Jason as he used his communication board to tell Caroline something. Robert's expression tightened. "I run a global technology company. My schedule is demanding. More demanding than being his father." The words hung between them. Caroline pretended to be occupied with Jason's wheelchair settings. "You're very direct, Ms. Rivera," Robert said finally. "Life's too short not to be. And if I'm going to work for you, you should know that I won't pretend not to notice when something's wrong." She met his gaze steadily. Jason deserves better than that. Robert's jaw worked for a moment, then surprisingly, one corner of his mouth lifted. "That's exactly why I called you." He gestured toward a private office. "Let's discuss the details." Inside, he closed the door, and his composure slipped. "Jason's mother left when he was 3. She couldn't handle his condition. I buried myself in work." He ran a hand through his hair. "The company was struggling then. I told myself I was securing his future by building the business. By the time I'd succeeded, there was this distance between us." Ellie stayed silent, sensing he rarely shared these thoughts. "When I saw you with him yesterday, I realized how much I've missed." His voice grew quieter. "How much he's missed." "It's not too late," Ellie said. "He's still here. You're still here." Robert nodded, looking suddenly tired. "The job is yours if you want it. Full benefits, including coverage for your mother's condition. And I'd be willing to fund your return to nursing school, once Jason is settled with you." Ellie's heart raced. It was more than she'd dared hope for. "Why me? You could hire anyone with more qualifications." "Because when you looked at my son, you saw Jason, not his wheelchair, not his limitations, just Jason." He extended his hand. "Do we have a deal?" Ellie hesitated. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about committing to Jason, and to pushing Robert to be the father his son needed. "On one condition," she said. "You have dinner with Jason every night you're not traveling. Real dinner, no phone. Just you and him, with me there to help if needed." Robert's eyebrows rose. "You're negotiating conditions with a potential employer." I'm establishing expectations with a father who wants better for his son. She didn't break eye contact. Those are my terms. A slow smile spread across Robert's face. You really are something, Ellie Rivera. He extended his hand again. Deal. She shook it, feeling as though she'd just stepped off a cliff, unsure if she would fly or fall. That evening, she visited her mother at the care facility. The nurse had warned her it was one of Mum's bad days. She might not recognize Ellie at all. Hey, Mum, she said, sitting beside the frail woman who had once been her rock. Her mother stared at her with vacant eyes. I got a new job today, Ellie continued, taking her mother's hand. It's going to make things better for us. She touched her pendant. Remember when Grandma gave me this? You told me we were like sparrows, small but strong. For a moment, something flickered in her mother's eyes, a brief spark of recognition that vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but it was enough. Ellie squeezed her hand, fighting back tears. We're going to be okay, Mom, I promise. On Monday morning, Ellie arrived at the Caldwell mansion with a small box of possessions for her room in the staff wing. As the security guard waved her through the gate, she spotted Jason and Robert waiting for her on the front steps. Jason was beaming, holding another clumsily wrapped package. Robert stood beside him, one hand resting on his son's shoulder. It was a small gesture, that hand on the shoulder, but to Ellie it felt like the first beat of wings, preparing for flight. 3 weeks into her new job, Ellie woke before dawn in her room in the Caldwell mansion's staff wing. The space was simple but elegant, more luxurious than any place she'd ever lived. Still, she hadn't fully unpacked her few possessions, as if part of her waited for this dream to dissolve. Her first task each morning was checking on Jason, who was often awake early, his sleep schedule irregular due to muscle spasms. She knocked softly on his door and entered to find him already alert, gazing out his window at the garden where the first hints of sunrise touched the trees. Morning, birdwatcher, she said, their private joke. Jason smiled, making a chirping sound that was their secret greeting. Over the past weeks, they'd developed a language of their own, part communication board, part gesture, part intuition. Ellie had learned that Jason's mind was sharp and curious, trapped in a body that refused to cooperate. Your dad's coming home today, she reminded him as she helped him with his morning routine. 3 whole days without business trips. Jason's face lit up, then clouded slightly. What is it? Ellie asked, pausing as she adjusted his wheelchair. He pointed to his communication board, selecting icons deliberately. You're worried he'll bring work home? Ellie translated. That he'll be distracted. Jason nodded, his expression somber. We made a deal, remember? Dinner together every night he's home, no phones. She squeezed his shoulder gently. And if he forgets, I'll remind him. That's the Ellie Rivera guarantee. After breakfast, she helped Jason with his exercises, stretches and movements designed to maintain his muscle tone. His physical therapist had taught her techniques to ease his frequent cramps, and she noted with satisfaction that his range of motion seemed marginally better. You're getting stronger, she said, supporting his arm as he extended it. Must be all those cheeseburgers I sneak you when the nutritionist isn't looking. Jason made a sound like laughter. Later, as she wheeled him through the extensive gardens behind the mansion, her phone rang. It was the care facility where her mother lived. Ms. Rivera, your mother had a difficult night, the nurse explained. She became agitated and kept asking for someone named Ellie. We had to administer a mild sedative. Ellie's heart constricted. She recognized my name? It appears so. These moments of clarity sometimes happen. It might be good if you could visit today. I'll be there, Ellie promised, ending the call. Jason looked at her questioningly. My mum, Ellie explained. She's having a rough day. She fingered her sparrow pendant. Sometimes I feel pulled in 2 directions, you know? Like I can't be enough for everyone who needs me. Jason reached for her hand, his movements jerky but determined. Thanks, buddy. She smiled. You're a good listener. They continued their circuit of the garden, pausing to observe a family of sparrows nesting in one of the ornamental trees. Jason pointed excitedly, then to her pendant. Yep, just like my necklace. Ellie watched the birds flit back and forth, carrying tiny bits of material to reinforce their nest. Always building, always working, but they do it together, see? The nest is stronger that way. When Robert's car pulled into the driveway that afternoon, Jason was waiting by the window. Ellie stood nearby, noting the tension in the young man's shoulders. For all his excitement, reunions with his father were still fraught with unspoken expectations. Robert entered, looking tired but pleased to be home. He carried a small gift bag. Hey, champ, he said, approaching Jason. I brought you something from Tokyo. Jason accepted the bag eagerly. Inside was a beautifully illustrated book on Japanese birds. They have some interesting sparrows there, Robert said, glancing at Ellie with a small smile. The salesperson helped me find something appropriate. The fact that Robert had remembered their shared interest in birds, something seemingly small, made Ellie realize he was trying in his own way. I need to visit my mother this evening, Ellie said. She's having a difficult day. Robert nodded. Of course. Take the car. But our dinner, she began. We'll wait for you, Robert said firmly. Jason and I can look through his new book together until you return. The care facility was quiet when Ellie arrived. Her mother sat in a chair by the window, her thin frame swallowed by a cardigan despite the warm weather. Her eyes, once sharp and perceptive, now gazed vacantly at the manicured lawn outside. Mom? Ellie said softly, sitting beside her. It's me, Ellie. For several minutes there was no response. Ellie took her mother's hand, telling her about Jason, about the sparrows in the garden, about the strange new turn her life had taken. I'm not sure I'm doing the right thing, she confessed. I'm helping them, but sometimes I wonder if I'm just a band-aid for a deeper wound between them. Her mother's fingers suddenly tightened around hers. Ellie, she said clearly, her eyes focusing. My little sparrow. Tears sprang to Ellie's eyes. You remember? Some days are clearer, her mother said, her voice frail but lucid. You always tried to fix everyone. I learned from the best, Ellie said, smiling through tears. You can't fix everything, sweetheart. Her mother's gaze drifted momentarily, then returned. But sometimes being present is enough. When Ellie returned to the mansion, she found Robert and Jason in the dining room. The table was set, dinner waiting under warming covers. Jason's communication board showed he'd been having a real conversation with his father. How's your mother? Robert asked as she took her seat. She knew me today, Ellie said, her voice catching. She called me her little sparrow. Robert nodded, understanding the significance. Family is complicated, he said quietly. We don't always know how to reach each other, even when we want to. As they ate, Ellie noticed small changes in their dynamic. Robert waited patiently while Jason formed his thoughts on his communication board. He asked questions that required more than yes or no answers. He was present in a way he hadn't been at the diner. Later that evening, after helping Jason prepare for bed, Ellie found Robert in his study, surrounded by documents but not actively working on them. He's asleep, she reported. The new book is already his favorite. Thank you, Ellie. Robert gestured to a chair. Please sit a moment. She sat, suddenly aware of the gulf between employer and employee that still existed despite the past weeks. Jason's doctors are impressed with his progress, Robert said. His physical therapist says his core strength has improved, and his speech therapist noted he's attempting more vocalization. He's always been capable, Ellie said. He just needed someone to expect him to be. Robert's expression turned reflective. When Jason was born and we learned about his condition, his mother and I reacted differently. She became overprotective. I became distant. He looked down at his hands. We both failed him, in our own ways. You're here now, Ellie said simply. Because of you. Robert met her gaze. You've created a bridge between us that I didn't know how to build. Bridges work both ways, Ellie replied. You're crossing it too. She stood to leave, then paused. The community center near my old apartment has a support group for families with disabled members. They meet on Thursday evenings. Robert looked surprised. You think I should go? I think Jason would appreciate knowing you're trying to understand his world better. She shrugged. Just a thought. As she turned to leave, Robert called after her. Ellie? Your mother. Would she be more comfortable here? We have a guest house by the garden. It's accessible and we could arrange for a nurse. The offer hung in the air between them, unexpected and profound. Why would you do that? Ellie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because, Robert said slowly, sparrows build their nests together. Ellie stood frozen. Her grandmother's words echoed back to her from this unlikely source. Something was shifting in the Caldwell house, something more complex than employer and employee, more meaningful than obligation and duty. That night, as she lay in bed, Ellie gazed at the ceiling, thinking about nests and bridges and the weight of small kindnesses that accumulate over time. Outside her window, she could hear the night birds calling to each other across the darkness, finding their way home. Autumn painted the Caldwell estate in shades of gold and crimson. 3 months had passed since Ellie had first walked through the ornate gates, 3 months of small victories and quiet transformations. Ellie's mother had moved into the garden guest house 2 weeks after Robert's offer. The transition hadn't been simple. Her mother's confusion had worsened temporarily with the change of environment, but having her close meant Ellie could visit morning and evening. The private nurse Robert hired specialized in Alzheimer's care, and the garden setting seemed to soothe her mother's restless moments. This morning, Ellie wheeled Jason along the stone path that wound through the Japanese maples. His strength continued to improve incrementally, but more striking was his increased vocalization. The speech therapist had been working with new techniques, and Jason could now form several clear words. Bird, he said, pointing toward a flash of wings. Good eye, Ellie praised, pausing so they could watch the cardinal flit between branches. Your dad's coming to your therapy session today. Jason's face brightened. Dad, he said carefully, the words still difficult but recognizable. They found Ellie's mother sitting on the guest house porch, wrapped in a blanket despite the mild temperature. Some days she recognized Ellie instantly. Other days she smiled politely at the nice young woman who visited so regularly. Today her eyes held recognition. There's my Ellie, she said. And Jason, have you come to check on my birds? They had hung bird feeders around the porch, creating a gathering place for finches, chickadees, and yes, sparrows. Jason had helped design the setup, insisting on feeders that attracted different species. We brought you something, Ellie said, helping Jason retrieve a small package from his backpack. Inside was a framed photo of Ellie, Jason, and her mother, taken during a clear day last month. They sat together on this very porch, surrounded by birds, all three smiling. In the background, slightly blurred but unmistakable, stood Robert, watching them with an expression of quiet contentment. What a lovely family, her mother said, touching the frame gently. Ellie felt a catch in her throat. The word family hung in the air, both incorrect and somehow true in ways she was still coming to understand. Later that afternoon, Ellie sat with Robert in his study, while Jason worked with his speech therapist. What had once been awkward meetings had evolved into comfortable conversations. Today, however, Robert seemed preoccupied. Is everything all right? Ellie asked, setting down the weekly schedule she'd prepared. The board wants me in Singapore next week, Robert said. Critical negotiations that can't be delegated. I see. Ellie nodded, already adjusting mental calendars. Jason will understand if you explain. I'm not going, Robert interrupted. I'm sending my CFO instead. Ellie blinked in surprise. But you said it was critical. It is. Robert leaned back in his chair. So is Jason's recital at the community center. He's worked too hard on that presentation to have me miss it. The recital was a small event where the therapy center clients would share their progress. Jason had been practicing for weeks on a short speech about birds, using his communication board alongside his growing vocabulary. The old Robert would have considered a business trip unquestionably more important. He'll be thrilled, Ellie said. Robert smiled. 6 months ago, I would have gone to Singapore without a second thought. He glanced at a framed photo on his desk, new since Ellie had started working there, of him and Jason feeding the garden birds. You've changed this house, Ellie. Changed us. I just helped you see what was already there. Nevertheless, Robert's expression grew serious. Which brings me to something I've been wanting to discuss, your nursing school application. Ellie straightened. With her mother's improved care situation and her stable employment, she'd finally reapplied to complete her nursing degree. The admissions office called yesterday. Robert continued. You've been accepted for the spring semester. They were quite impressed with your application and your recommendation letters. You wrote me a recommendation? I did. So did Jason's physical therapist and the director of your mother's former care facility. Robert slid a folder across the desk. This is for you, a scholarship from the Caldwell Foundation. It covers full tuition and includes a stipend for expenses. Ellie stared at the folder, emotions churning. I can't accept. You can and you will, Robert said firmly. It's not charity, Ellie. It's an investment in someone extraordinary. His voice softened. Besides, Jason would never forgive me if you left us completely. The scholarship requires only that you continue working here, part-time. Robert, She stopped, searching for words. You don't have to decide now, he said, but the offer stands. Before she could respond, Jason's voice came through the intercom system they'd installed to help him communicate throughout the house. Dad, Ellie, come! They hurried to the garden, where Jason pointed excitedly toward the large oak tree. There, nearly hidden among the branches, was a sparrow's nest, a mother bird perched on its edge, feeding tiny hatchlings whose beaks peeked above the rim. Family, Jason said clearly, looking at Ellie with eyes bright with meaning. That evening, after Jason was asleep, Ellie walked to her mother's guest house. The night was cool, stars visible between scattered clouds. Her mother was having one of her clear evenings, sitting by the fireplace with a photo album in her lap. I found this among my things, she said, patting the space beside her. The album contained photos from Ellie's childhood, birthday parties, school performances, family picnics, memories her mother could no longer reliably access, but that lived in these faded images. You were always taking care of others, her mother said, pointing to a picture of young Ellie bandaging her cousin's scraped knee. Even then. I learned from you, Ellie replied, leaning against her mother's shoulder. And now? Her mother looked at her with surprising clarity. Who takes care of you, my little sparrow? The question lingered as Ellie later walked the moonlit path back to the main house. At the halfway point she paused, gazing at the Caldwell mansion illuminated against the night sky. When she'd first arrived, it had seemed like a fortress, imposing and unwelcoming. Now she could see the warm lights in the windows, the signs of life within. On the front steps sat a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. Her name was written across the top in Robert's neat handwriting. Inside was a silver picture frame, elegantly simple. It contained a professional photograph of Jason beaming from his wheelchair, Ellie standing behind him with one hand on his shoulder, Robert beside them, looking not at the camera, but at them, his expression one of quiet pride. Around the frame's edge, tiny sparrows were engraved in flight, A note accompanied it. Some nests are built slowly, each twig and strand carried one by one, but they endure. Ellie touched the engraved birds, remembering her grandmother's words about resilience, about finding ways to thrive. She thought of her mother's question about who cared for her. The answer, she realized, had been building around her all these months, twig by twig, moment by moment. The scholarship folder still sat in her room, an opportunity to complete what she'd once begun. But she understood now that education wasn't the only path forward she'd found here. There was something else growing, a connection, a belonging, a kind of family constructed not from obligation but from choice. From the guest house window, her mother's light still glowed softly. In his room, Jason slept peacefully, his communication board filled with words for tomorrow. Somewhere in the house, Robert was likely still working, but he'd be at breakfast in the morning, increasingly present in ways that mattered. Ellie stood in the space between these points of light, the weight of the frame solid in her hands. Like the sparrows engraved upon it, she had found unexpected shelter. Like them, she had helped build something sturdy enough to weather storms. She climbed the steps and opened the door, carrying the frame and all it represented. Home. For now, that was enough. Don't forget to like this video if you believe in the power of love to break down walls and bridge any divide. Please do comment your feedback and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of family, redemption, and the triumph of love over pride. Remember, it's never too late to change your story.